our listeners would potentially be quite perplexed by the subject matters that we're beginning to cover, that the abbot Trithemius is writing on. How would you offer listeners who are from sort of a Catholic background, potentially with quite a traditional leaning, but have a suspicion of the term occult or the term esoteric? What would you say?
So you know what I would say to that is what he was researching at the time was basically the science, the philosophy, the medicine, the discoveries, the religious discoveries, talking about angels and so forth, coming through study of Jewish literature. Now, the term occult, in its Latin form, occultus simply means something which is not obvious. And so we find this term used quite freely by the patristic authors, talking about the hidden meaning of the gospel or the hidden meaning of a prophecy. So in itself, it's nothing to be worried about. It just means something which is not obvious. Its negative connotations came to the fore largely as a consequence of not Catholicism, but Protestantism. Because the Protestant approach, the Catholic approach to learning has always been Catholic or eclectic. We're not afraid of any of the discoveries, any of the insights or approaches that might be tested. Whereas the Protestant approach was somewhat more puritanical. It said, you've got the Bible, that's enough. You don't need to know anything more. And, you know, someone like Luther and his followers took this to extremes, saying you don't even need to read Cicero or Plato. You just need the Bible, that's it. And because of this, they falsely represented Catholics in a kind of slanderous campaign, saying Catholics, they're praying to saints and angels, using incense, rosary beads. This is occult. And this was where the negative reaction to the term occult and esoteric came into being. So if we look at what might be called the occult writings, the writings about, for example, interpreting the meaning of the stars or the property of stones or herbs, we find this in saints, the Venerable Bede, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, and so forth. So it's nothing which Catholics need to be frightened of. Of course, there is this, this side of invoking demonic spirits, but this is something which is quite separate from what these authors were doing. And of course, they would never recommend anything like that. And no sane person would. But simply the investigation of the hidden properties of nature, of our world, and of God. And, you know, the Catholic understanding of the world is that it's not simply matter versus spirit. Spirit, mysticism is what goes on essentially in your mind or your soul. The rest of the world just works according to mechanical physical laws. That, Brian, is the Protestant approach. The Catholic approach is to see reality as kind of subjective encounter, which is both physical and mystical, both at the same time. In fact, there's no real distinction between the two. Because you think about it, the world which each of us inhabits is primarily the world of our own spirit, of our own mind.
That's fascinating. So what you're describing is more like a poetic structure of reality. You might say a poetic metaphysics, where relationality is far more important than sort of separated individuality.
Absolutely, you know, and the truth of this approach, I think, is abundantly clear. Two people can encounter precisely the same physical reality, and each of them receive a completely different experience from it, a completely different meaning from it. So what are they really encountering? We're living in a world of our own meaning and connection. And I think we need to move beyond the materialistic, versus spiritual metaphysics ontology, which is imprinted into us from an early age. And I believe that this is actually a consequence of Protestantism, then Puritanism and rationalism, which actually stems from this. The view that the world in itself, life, nature, is not mystical but purely mechanical, and the mystical is a completely different realm. You look at the writings of the saints, the Catholics, throughout the Middle Ages, and there's miracles, angels, visions, and so forth. And this, I believe, constitutes the real substance of life. I think this is the great value of, of course, I'm not going to say the occult scene as a whole is something which I could recommend people get into. But I say one thing about it, that it admits or appreciates the reality of the spiritual and mystical dimension of existence. And in my opinion, that is a lot less dangerous than materialistic reductionism.
Right. Some of our more skeptical listeners might respond that the church has at various times used condemnatory language to concepts like divination. How are we to deal with that and bring it together with what you've already said? Okay,
it has put out condemnations at various points in time. So these condemnations, one of the very first ones was the practice of opening the Bible at random for a prophecy. And, this was seen as, not so good. Or believing also that the signs of nature were fixed or infallible, that they offered a certain guide about what was going to happen, which of course is a mistake. Now, for example, Thomas Aquinas, he actually believed in what we would call astrology, the influence of the stars on human events. But he did say that this influence didn't take away people's free will. It wasn't like an absolutely predetermined. And I think when we look at the writings of people like the Venerable Bede and so forth, they're saying, yes, these are useful things to do. They're not giving you a fixed or concrete result that is unchangeable. And they're not infallible either. I think that the church is right to warn people against superstitions, which I would describe as something which is hard to describe. But I think the key thing about superstition is it's being exploited by someone for their own benefit, but simply observation of the world, of nature in its totality, and forming judgments based on that is repeatedly actually affirmed by the church as being something which is quite valid. You think about someone predicting the weather. Even if they're a scientific meteorologist, fundamentally what they're doing is saying, what do I see at the moment? And extrapolating this, what's probably going to happen next.
Right, just because it has a veneer of scientific terminology or mathematical terminology doesn't make it categorically different from trying to interpret the signs.
And Christ himself says, you see the sky in the evening and it's red, and the next day is going to be like this. We know that the Magi, the wise men from the east, they followed a star to find the location of Christ. Scripture is filled with these type of wondrous events, with divinization, because the church says don't abuse these things, don't allow yourself to be exploited or fooled, or don't try to take away the fact that no matter what you do, you still don't know for sure what's going to happen. So I think we should be more relaxed about this, and at the same time, I think everyone should basically not be too gullible and think, oh well, whatever anyone says must be true because they've said it. I mean, I think with all these things, we should be in the position of reading them sensitively and respectfully and seeing what they offer, but not necessarily just saying, well, it's true. I think we get mistaken when we think the church or religion is just a social function. It's to promote social justice and so forth. To me, that is not so much what the church is there for. That's what governments are for. And that we need to unlock this mysticism of our own tradition. Realize that the Catholic faith is not a closed door, but rather it is eclectic, bringing in these traditions from the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Hebrews, even from further afield, and of course from our own Western European tradition, which people are often a bit afraid to affirm explicitly because you might seem nationalist or whatever. But I think we need to reawaken this Western spirituality, and this can't be done without the Catholic faith, which is so central to it.
That's exceptionally interesting. Thank you so much, Father Robert.